If you live a life of exclusion, soon you will find yourself excluded. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. We are here for another short story discussion, which will appear in two separate playlists here on the channel. Number one being the short story discussion playlist, now over 100 videos strong, I believe. And number two being a short story by short story read-along of Let Me Tell You by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson, one of the most underrated writers of the English language, in my opinion. And this short story is no exclusion to, or no, it is part of that sort of library of underrated short stories from Shirley Jackson, underrated books from Shirley Jackson, underrated existence of Shirley Jackson in the American letters landscape. So this video will have three separate portions: a So What Happened recap of the short story, a literary criticism section, and a writer's corner where we discuss some of the things that we can take from this short story as writers ourselves. So, what happened? Mrs. Spencer is uppity and unhappy to receive a letter from the Oberons, who Mrs. Spencer hates. They're looking for a place to stay nearby. She's going to ignore their letter. But later they call. She ignores them. But there's a bad connection in the call, maybe. It depends on how much we trust Mrs. Spencer. So they stop by and leave a note on the door, and she rues the marks that they left on her door. She throws the note away and gets ready to entertain the guests on the evening. It goes okay, and the next day she's approached by a woman who is looking for tenants and asks Mrs. Spencer about the Oberons. This is a person that her husband had suggested to her that the Oberons might sort of try to get in contact with. She didn't get them in contact with her. She doesn't know how they got in contact with this woman. Probably it's from her husband. Mrs. Spencer has nothing bad to say about them, nothing bad to say about them to this person looking for tenants, so that woman lets them move into the house. And they go about town using her name, the temerity. It turns out they're very, very popular, and they throw great parties. One day, she comes home to the babysitter in an otherwise empty house. The babysitter was left to tell her about the Oberons' party. Everyone has gone to the Oberons, and the babysitter is upset that she had to stay and let Mrs. Spencer know. Mrs. Spencer is furious at this. She gets in the car and speeds over there. Almost. She cannot find the house, so she goes home. And when her family finally gets home, she's furious at them for having had a good time at the Oberons. So, where do we start with criticism of this short story? Well, we can start with the very opening line of the short story, as you can with most great short stories. The opening line to this short story reads as such: "The first sign that the Oberons were coming might have been the early blossoms on the peach tree, but Mrs. Oberon did not know until she got the letter. Peaches are a symbol for love, fertility, and prosperity. That is why it might have been a sign, but she was blind to this sign." Now, this feeds into a deeper idea in this short story. We get on page 31 of this text, Mrs. Spencer saying, "Some people really have no consideration for other people," Mrs. Spencer said, touching the letter with one finger. This is an irony of character. I don't know if irony of character is a real term, but it's something that I use, because Mrs. Spencer's own character of exclusion, Mrs. Spencer's own character of being uppity, leaves her completely blind to her own actions. Mrs. Spencer is exclusionary. Mrs. Spencer thinks that there are certain people with whom she can and will operate, and people with whom she cannot and will not. She, in this little moment, Some people really have no consideration for other people, is completely blind to her own actions of exclusion. So she doesn't know that she is being exclusionary in excluding people who she believes should be excluded. And she thinks that those people should know that they should be excluded and excludes them. But it turns out in this case that these people, the Oberons, are very popular. People we don't even meet in this short story. Now, Mrs. Spencer is also a type of person that you know. You've all met a Mrs. Spencer because she's constantly complaining about something. She's always put out by other people. On 37, we have this example. Mrs. Spencer was considerably annoyed at the interruptions from her neighbors, who bade her good morning or asked about her health, or stood in her way before the shelves. This is a person who enjoys seemingly nothing more than entertaining other people. She, again, is blind to her exclusionary ways. Her neighbors should know, just stay out of her way. Just stay out of her way. Further on this page, we get another quote from, or another sort of example in here. That doesn't sound good, Mr. Sanson. Will you please get me another? She is talking about a can in her order. She has picked it up off the shelf. She has brought it to be rung up. And then she decides this can is no good. You should get me another. He glanced up at her, so briefly that she barely saw, and left the counter to fetch her another can of peas. It's such a nuisance, she said to the woman waiting behind her in line. These days, everything's so poorly made. The woman turned her head to the side and looked impatient. She doesn't care for what she feeds her family, Mrs. Spencer thought, and shrugged. And Mr. Sanson returned with a sounder can of peas. The woman behind her sees her as the nuisance, while Mrs. Spencer is assuming that it is a faulty can of peas that is the nuisance. One of the things that rises in Shirley Jackson's writing from time to time and is one of her strongest points because it's something that's very difficult to pull off in literature. The writer here is giving us this character. This is the main point of the short story is Mrs. Spencer. The way that Mrs. Spencer is seen by other people is very hard to actually convey in literature without telling us how these other people feel. Shirley Jackson is able to do this through their actions. The other woman looked away. Mrs. Spencer sees this as a fault with that other woman, as opposed to a fault with herself. And then she sort of judges Mr. Sanson as well. So just a really, really good example there. Then we have on 43, maybe the point of the entire short story. This is she has confronted the babysitter. The babysitter was asked to stay and explain to Mrs. Spencer why the kids aren't there, where her husband is, all of these things. She says, so the babysitter says, so I guess I won't be back anymore. She's huffing and puffing. She's angry at this confrontation with Mrs. Spencer. Just as you please, Dorothy, Mrs. Spencer said, but the door slammed behind Dorothy and her words trailed off. The house was very still. Mrs. Spencer's planning had somehow never taken into account the fact that she might come home and not find Harry and the children. Uncertain, she turned towards the stairs, thinking to go and change her stockings, and then hesitated. She had told Harry and the children, had she not, that the Oberons were not socially acceptable? This was just like her sister. This pushing and climbing and refusing to take no for an answer until nice people were forced to visit out of sheer weariness. They will be making a great fuss over Harry and the children to get at me, Mrs. Spencer thought. I must go at once and put a stop to it. This is the first example in the story of Mrs. Spencer being left without. It is not the last. At the end of the story, Mrs. Spencer is left without. She is left alone. If you live a life of exclusion, soon you will find yourself excluded. And this is where Mrs. Spencer finds herself, not just here, but at the end of the short story as well. This is also a good example of the overbearing mother archetype. And this is something that I got from Quora, from someone called Assistant Bot. So I just sort of browsing about the internet for good examples of what it means to be the overbearing mother. And this was probably about as good as I could find. And it comes from Quora. The concept of the devouring mother is often discussed in psychological and cultural contexts, particularly in relation to the dynamics of the mother-child relationships. This archetype is characterized by a mother who is overly protective, controlling, or suffocating, resulting in negative psychological effects on the child. Here are some key aspects of the psychology of the devouring mother: overprotectiveness, control, emotional manipulation. This is kind of where this short story lives. This archetype may use guilt or emotional manipulation to keep the child dependent, creating a bond that is more about the mother's needs than the child's well-being. Fear of abandonment. Often the devouring mother acts out of her own fears, such as fear of abandonment or inadequacy, projecting these onto the child. So, fear of abandonment or inadequacy. I think we have every reason in this short story to believe that Mrs. Spencer does feel inadequate, and she weaponizes this against other people, trying to exclude them. Psychological impact on the child: dependency, low self-esteem, difficulty in relationships, resentment and guilt. As they grow older, children may feel resentment towards their mother or for a lack of autonomy, yet also feel guilty for wanting to break free from her influence. We have every reason to believe that this is sort of where things in this short story are leading. These children went and had a very good time at the Oberons, and we believe they're going to pay for it when they get home. Cultural and mythological context. The archetype can be found in myths and literature, often representing the tension between nurturing and suffocating love. In some interpretations, the devouring mother is linked to figures like mythological figure of Demeter, or even certain depictions of the Virgin Mary, where the nurturing aspect becomes toxic. Then we have some other things there, not necessarily pertinent here. So, pardon me. Writer's Corner, what can we take from this short story as writers ourselves? Well, this short story starts off very fast. The first sign that the Oberons were coming might have been early blossoms on the peach tree, but Mrs. Spencer did not know until she got the letter. It came on Thursday when Mrs. Spencer was already beginning to feel the tensions of anxiety over the day, with guests invited for dinner and Donnie's dentist appointment at 3, itself requiring split-second timing at the school. And then there was the shopping to be done and the flowers to be arranged and the lemon cream to be made early this week to avoid the near catastrophe of last time, when people actually had to eat with spoons. Now, here was a strange letter in the mail. We get a lot of Mrs. Spencer's characterization up front. We know that there is a lot of tension in her. We know that her life is a sort of cluster of anxiety, and we feel that right there. Now, one of the other things to take from basically all Shirley Jackson is a very, very smooth writer. You can read this short story so fast that you don't feel the impact. That's one of the joys of rereading Shirley Jackson, is that there's so much more there than you experience on the first read-through. Something that is one of the hallmarks of good writing, I actually got from Kurt Vonnegut, Kurt Vonnegut's 8 Tips to Writing, something like that. You can find it. You can find it on Google. Very famous. Kurt Vonnegut says, and this is not a direct quote, despite the fact that I put it in quotations, make your character want something, even if it is only a glass of water. One of the things that keeps this short story moving so quickly is that Mrs. Spencer constantly wants something. She is constantly after something. Really, she's constantly after approval. Pardon me, but this manifests in her life through constant anxiety over wanting things to go well, wanting to be perceived as someone perhaps that she is not, or certainly that she feels she is not. So if this were in a workshop, if this were a workshop piece, and far be it from me to give advice to one of the greats like Shirley Jackson, but I think there is something that could have made this short story a little bit better at the end. If this were in a workshop, the one critique really that I would have for it, at the end, I would have Mrs. Spencer lock her keys in the car. If she locks her keys in the car, first off, she is making another mistake. Very difficult for characters like Mrs. Spencer to come to terms with the fact that they have made a mistake, that they have screwed something up. One other thing that this would also leave her shut out of her own house. There's symbolism there. One thing that this would also necessitate, whether we got it in the short story or not, we would know there was a coming conversation to be had with her husband. She has locked the keys in the car. I need you to let me in the house to get the spare. We don't have to have that in the text. We don't have to have that bit of the story given to us. We know that it is necessitated by what has happened. That is what I have for this short story discussion, Mrs. Spencer and the Oberons by Shirley Jackson. If you like or appreciate this sort of thing, hitting the like button really does help me out. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, hitting the subscribe button, make sure that you are back for literature. There is poetry on the channel every Monday, and I hope to have you back for the next one.